Allison, thank you so much for joining us. Really happy to have you here and excited to learn about your background and what you've been working on. So maybe we could start there and you could just tell us a little bit more about your journey and how you got to where you are today.
Awesome. Well, first, thank you so much for having me. I love talking about partnerships and all this fun. I always like to say I kind of accidentally ended up in partnerships, and I feel like a lot of people start with that. But in college, I actually studied food marketing and food new product development. So I was so nerdy. I loved like going into grocery stores and looking at new stuff that people came up with, like the packaging and the science behind it, and like shelf psychology, like why things were positioned the way that they were. So I thought I was going to become a CPG brand manager. Like I had it all figured out. Like I was going to work at SCJ, had the whole thing planned. And then I actually applied to be an intern at American Express on a complete whim as a junior in college, and actually was accepted. And it turned out to be like one of the best things that ended up happening to me. And I ended up joining a team that was focused on new product development partnerships for this new set of APIs that Amex had just built, which today sounds pretty usual, right? But back in like 2010, this was like super innovative that Amex was building these APIs and was going to work with all these fintechs. And a very long story short, I ended up absolutely loving it. And what I thought was going to be a very short summer at Amex actually turned into a 5-year stint. So I ended up having a number of different roles there. I actually started in product, and I loved working with engineering and building out new products and everything from white space. But one of the things that drove me like absolutely nuts was it took a while to build things at Amex, and we were watching a lot of startups and fintechs just go to market in just a few months. And I really loved that side of, how can we think about the power of Amex and its scale and its brand and its relationships, but like, why are we building this stuff for ourselves? Like, why aren't we working with all these fintechs who are, going to eat our lunch if they go to market so quickly and kind of leave us in the dust? Um, I ended up actually shifting into more of a innovation slash partnerships role where I got to work with all of these startups. And again, that sounds so commonplace now, but back in like 2012, like this was pretty innovative for Amex to be taking this approach. So I ended up doing that for a couple of years, and I just fell in love with startups. So got the bug myself and ended up jumping over to a digital identity startup called Dashlane. And that was going from this 65,000 person company, a brand that everybody knew, to a 200 person French tech company that was just starting to expand into the US. And I was the second hire on the partnerships team, but it was my first experience ever building everything out from white space. So, first time building out channel partnerships, tech partnerships with APIs, working with banks. It was all completely white space. And I loved it, honestly. Felt like moving a million miles an hour. We were very much building the plane as we were flying it, dodging missiles, all that kind of stuff. And by the time I left Dashlane, I was head of partnerships. We had a number of deals running, and that's when I really knew that like this was absolutely what I wanted to do. Um, so I ended up actually jumping back to Amex, which is quite common actually. They
Yeah.
call them the boomerangs. And there's this really cool group called Digital Labs, and they're one of the most innovative teams at Amex. They're the ones that are watching every new trend that's happening, some of the smartest product and engineering talent I've ever worked with. And I joined the team that was leading the digital wallet relationships. So Apple Pay, Google Pay, Samsung Pay. And it was really an interesting time to be there. It was the intersection of large techs working with large FIs in a little bit of this kind of this frenemy position. Honestly, we both needed each other to grow. There was a lot of use cases and expansions and data negotiations and all of those components. And that was going really well. I had an absolute rock star team that was crushing it. It was much more on the partner management side than on the BD side where I'd come from. And all things were going kind of straightforward. And then a company that I'd never heard of called C2FO reached out and recruited me to be their head of partnerships. So I joined C2FO peak pandemic in October of 2020. and left my, relatively safe job at American Express to become the first partnerships hire at a, relatively mature but first new to partnerships fintech. So I've been at C2FO for the last 2 years, and today run their partnerships team as part of their exec crew as well.
Amazing, amazing, and there's so many good things to dig into there. Funnily enough, so I had quite a similar experience with American Express as well. So I took like a temp job in the summer, and planned for that to kind of be the end of it. And then same
Mhm.
as you, 5 years later, I was like, whoa, like the time flew, and it was
Yeah.
amazing how people would leave Amex and go and do other things, and then come back, or people would be let go sometimes, during layoffs or whatever, and maybe they'd take like 6 months to a year working somewhere else, and then they'd come back. It has that effect on people, I think, because it is a great company to work for. It's like
Company.
as good as
Honestly,
it gets.
I owe a huge part of my career to Amex, and they really invest in moving people
Yeah.
around to try a ton of different things. And some of the best people I ever worked with were at Amex, and I'm still close with them now. It's an awesome company.
Yeah, yeah, me too. Even like one of my old managers, this I'm talking about 2008, 2009. Uh, he was in San Francisco and hit me up, and we ended up meeting up and catching up on all things Blue Box. And yeah, it's a great time. Okay, so I got to ask straight away. First of all, like being, being the food background that you are, like, what's your favorite food partnership that you've seen?
Oh my
Yeah.
Honestly, this is so dorky, but I'm like such a huge fan even now. There's all these like collaborations happening. Like, okay, my favorite one, right? It was like Taco Bell working with like hot flamin' Cheetos, for example, right? You were like, what is this monstrosity? You're like, I don't know, would I really ever eat it? But you so badly want to. And that is the stuff that like I just absolutely love within
Yeah.
partnerships. It's like such a good brand play. It's fun. There's a food science element. uh, One of the coolest things I ever worked on when I was like a food science intern, like back in the day, I worked on the first gluten-free bakery line in the
Mm.
US. And I also worked on new flavors for like Dunkin' Donuts culottes. And that's what just gave me that, that like, oh man, there's like a lot of cool stuff you could do here. And it's like total white space. But I never did anything as cool as, tacos.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. The Cheetos taco. I've seen the ads for those. That's super smart. I think like there's you and I, we both work in like tech partnerships
Yeah.
mainly, like and so the that there isn't as much eyes on these kind of interesting co-branding and distribution partnerships. We run a weekly newsletter called the PLDR, where we try and like highlight some of these cool partnerships, because there's such interesting stuff happening. Yeah, and like there's some great examples. And so like tell me, I worked at Amex while you were there, and at the time that you were working on this API stuff, I was still using Lotus Notes, I think, to submit tickets. So
Oh
like,
God.
yeah, 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 and like using back end systems on like support teams and all sorts of different stuff. It's like,
Yeah.
and so you were most definitely a startup within like a big company, and I
Yeah.
would just love to hear about like how like what like for I think a lot of people that are in our community are in partnerships roles in more traditional companies, or they're trying to like move their company to a more modern approach potentially. It would be awesome to hear about like your experience doing that at Amex, and like how your team tackled that, and how how you brought like traditional execs along for the journey, the whole thing.
Yeah. Honestly, it's one of my favorite topics because there's just so much to be had at a company like Amex. And when you think about a place like Amex, there's so many layers, right? And you think about just how critical that stakeholder expansion is. And I remember, I was working in one of my second roles there. I was very convinced that we could bring on this B2B payments innovation company. And if we brought them to all of our existing merchants, that we would be able to steal share from check and bring it on to card. And, this was like the early days of virtual card. And, this was all just starting to happen. And I feel like the biggest thing that I took away from that experience was people were into the idea, right? Like it was like, oh, that's so cool. It's really innovative and shiny. But as you work through, there are just so many stage gates to go through the process. So with product, it's, hey, couldn't we just maybe build this ourselves? Why do we need to work with a partner? But at the same time, maybe your roadmap is booked out for the next 12 months anyway. If you're lucky, maybe it's 16 or 20. With all the different compliance or legal groups, it's, hey, what is the risk? What are the data policies? Do we trust this partner? Who are they existing? There's so many different processes that you go through. And I think one of the things that became really fundamental to even the approach that I use now is all the anticipation that you can do. You can spend 2 years trying to build a new product or a new partnership at a company like Amex unless you anticipate the questions that you are going to get in advance. And there's all those opportunities for trust building when you're working through those internal stakeholders if you put in the prep work to know. So, as an example, at Amex, there was this process that you go through. You literally get up in front of this group of like 20 people with different stakeholders from various compliance teams who just ask you questions. And if you did not have a satisfactory answer to those questions, you were not getting through. And that group met once a quarter. So it was a really big opportunity for you to go through that. And I saw people get up there with maybe like a little bit, just a little bit of prep, thinking they could wing it. Nope. You're 6 months down the line. And you understand why those groups have to exist. I always say, every check in a process is because there was a bad experience at some point. But we really earned a lot of trust through our stakeholders by just prepping for the hell out of those meetings. We would ask in advance, we go to the stakeholders, hey, what is your concern? Like, what are the different things? What could we bring to address your concerns? And we would do that for legal, for compliance, for marketing, for product, for engineering. And in some cases, it felt like a bit of overkill. But it also was a really big trust builder. So, in the same way that you build trust with your partners as you bring those deals along, I would argue that at a company like Amex or a big company doing innovation, that is just as much, if not more important than a lot of the collaboration and negotiation with your partner. It's all just a trust game at the end of the day.
Yeah, yeah, that's amazing. And I think you kind of mentioned there, like interviewing people and getting feedback, and I think that that's like fantastic advice. And I would
Yeah.
love to hear a little bit about, because I've struggled with that in itself. I've also struggled with like really identifying who the right stakeholders are to engage. And like,
Yeah.
I think that there's an art in that as well. Like not just, okay, who's got the most senior title and who's the most influential people, but like, who do you need on your side and what could break? And like, how did you go about figuring that out at a company like Amex? Because Amex is, it's an amazing place. Like we talked about, it's also a political beast, right? There's, and like might not be as open with you as they would be at a startup. So yeah, like how did you identify who the key people were in these processes?
It's so true. I always call it like going after like the influencers. So we would literally take the time, put it out on a whiteboard of, okay, in this big meeting that we have coming up, who are the individual teams, who are their direct reports, and who are their direct reports.
Mm.
And we would start with the second tier of direct reports. And we would say, hey, here's the concept that we're thinking about. Here's a few things that we would expect that you're going to push us on. And here's our thoughts. Like, what are we not thinking about? Like, please tell me where I'm wrong. And when you come with like that level of like vulnerability and openness, and you're really asking for feedback genuinely, you're not just saying, hey, you'll sign off on this, right? But when you come with that, you start to get that feedback and you build it in and you say, okay, thank you so much for the time and you appreciate it. And you bring that person along and you go to their manager and you say, like, hey, what would you think? Like, what are we not thinking about? And over time, you get better. You start to understand what those teams think about, what their concerns are, what their goals are. You bring them along and you turn them from people that are, potentially hesitant into advocates. But
Hmm.
in the same way that we go through external companies, we would do the same thing at Amex. And ultimately, when you get into that big meeting, you know that that executive has been prepped by their team who are now advocates and bringing you along. So we use that as a theme, even at C2FO for every one of my teams. It's how do you bring people along so they're invested? You should never go into a room knowing that there's a potential blocker. It's everything that you can possibly do to make sure that those people are advocates for you.
Yeah, I love that because I think people spend so much time on the idea and on the project and like formalizing the whole thing, but like it's all wasted if the people that are going to be able to say no, right?
It's so true. It's absolutely true. And then you figure out, especially along that time, that like those advocates are not just like a stage gate in the process. They're probably going to give you feedback that is going to make a much stronger partnership or a much stronger product that you weren't even thinking about.
And so I imagine, like, when you're working on partnerships at a company like Amex, you know, you've got the brand, you've got like the revenue, like the kind of people want to work with Amex, I would imagine, mostly. I'm excited to talk later on about the frenemy stuff, and maybe
Yeah.
we'll come back to it. But like at large, people want to work with Amex, right?
Yeah.
But like, what were some of the challenges that you ran into? Because I can imagine one of them is like, hey, these companies are moving way faster and have like more technical resources and like a bunch of stuff that Amex doesn't have as like a natively traditional finance company. So like, I would love to hear about some of those challenges and how you navigated them.
It's a really good call, and it's so fascinating because people are often like, "Oh, well, like Amex has a ton of account managers or client managers and has a ton of marketing muscle, so you guys just like throw anything up there and it'll be a home run." Honestly, the challenge for us for Amex was not just like the number of stakeholders that were involved, it's the pace of how far out things happened. I would always joke that we would finish our budgeting process for one year, in October, and okay, great, the next month you're starting for the following year after that. So roadmaps are being set, 12 months in advance. So if you have an idea that a fintech can move on in 3 months, you're going to have to move a lot of mountains
Yeah.
and get a lot of trust in order to do that. So for us, it was the timing, but then it was also the cohesiveness and focus around strategy, right? You have 10 different business units that are going generally in the same direction, but when you get to individual teams, who has these specific KPIs? Who's gold against this? Their individual performance are tied to certain KPIs. They might not care that much about your shiny toy partnership, right? So for us, where we found some success was being very laser focused on what are our VP's goals? What are their counterpart VP goals? What are the different challenges? What are the areas where we know that, Amex is never going to build like an AR automation platform compared to some of the other ones that are out there in the world. It's never going to be its area of expertise. So where can we show like a very clear natural fit where we start with a light pilot? It's just a pilot. It's just a test where we have very defined metrics of success. And we go out, we do that with a partner. We figure out ways to reduce all of the risk going into that. We have a lot of people bought in. But so we have the proof points from that pilot so that when the next roadmap conversation comes up, then we can ask for the big swings. And that became, I don't think I ever did a single partnership at Amex that was not structured around a proof of concept pilot or a test first. But the key was finding a partner who was willing to do that. And that's the other side of it, right? Because you have these fintechs who are moving super, super fast. They know the upside of working with Amex, but they're also very aware of some of the challenges in doing
Mhm.
so.
Yeah, and so let's talk about the frenemy situation. I think like you spend enough time working with any company as a partner and you start to find some overlapping work and services, but obviously like when you're working with fintechs that are and Amex does everything. Like a lot of people don't know that Amex is like the biggest travel agent in the world, and
Yep.
Amex is also like one of the biggest money exchange providers, and like you list it and Amex does it pretty much, right? Um, and so like, how did you manage that? Like both internally at Amex, but also like with these partners that I'm sure must have been thinking, hey, what if Amex decides to build this themselves at some point?
For sure, for sure. And honestly, it's a really fascinating time to be in fintech because that is across every single partnership that we have, and even in our new world. So at the time that that my team was managing Apple Pay and Google Pay, you would see things like Apple Pay, for example. I think this is very widely known knowledge that an issuer will pay a transaction fee for every transaction that goes through Apple Pay versus if it just happened on plastic, we're not paying that additional fee. So if you're just looking at the numbers and cents, you can make an argument to say, you know what, it doesn't make sense. Like, we want to stifle Apple Pay. Like, you could have that really kind of short term thinking. And you could have the same thing around Google Pay as an example. Google Pay has expanded pretty rapidly, not just to be on Android devices, but to evolve the definition of Google
Mm,
Pay. You know,
yeah.
you're starting to see it in things like Google Chrome, and you think about all the different places where Google could place their own digital wallet. So for us, it was a really interesting time where we were overseeing expansions. Like, you can now use Apple Pay on the New York City subway. Couldn't do that, you know, a year prior. So you're starting to see the use cases grow, and you're starting to see the margins go, which, by the way, is not just Apple and Google. It's a lot of other reasons you're starting to see, you know, merchant discount rates decrease. And it was a fascinating time to be doing it. So we spent a lot of time thinking about what were the 12-month roadmaps, not just for product engineering, but for a business strategy perspective for both of those partners. But how could we also think about the 3-year, the 5-year, and then what they could mean to American Express over time? And it was less about, hey, we're worried that these two are going to like shave off our margin or gain a greater you know, gain a greater foothold with our customers. And it became more of, how do we identify opportunities together where there's not card spend, where we can be going after new experiences that just add value to customers? So things like the subway, or using Google Pay, you know, in new contexts in web. How do we reduce friction during checkouts and think about rising tides lift all boats? But at the same time, how do we make sure that our brand, which, as you know and everyone knows, is massively valuable to Amex, how do we make sure that Amex doesn't become a white labeled provider for all things payments, right? So it was this constant dance of keeping an eye on the long term, but also making sure that the pieces that were really important to us were still there. And I was really fortunate at Amex where we had this cross functional crew between product, BD, and engineering that were constantly evaluating these opportunities in collaboration with our marketing partners and brand. There was meetings. I was with the president of Amex to that level that
Wow.
we were talking about these wallets. So it was a really cool experience, but really interesting to kind of toe the right line and figure out the line as you go.
That's really cool. Yeah, and I know that you know, at Amex, the at the executive level, you know, you definitely feel a little bit starstruck. You know, like I definitely did. Like a couple of times where I got to engage with people at like a really senior level. It's like a funny thing, isn't it? That you definitely feel that
I,
way.
I've never spent more time on a deck than I did in my life. My team would laugh a lot about it at this point, but it's still seared into memory
Yeah,
years
it's
later.
amazing. It's totally amazing, isn't it? And so okay, so like teleporting forward to working at Dashlane, and
Yeah,
like you're building a partner program for the first time now,
yeah,
and like that's a tough one, right? That's why partnership leaders exists. It's awesome that
yeah.
you're a member of partnership leaders. Like you know, the history being that Chris and I worked on the Optimize the Partner program the first time round, and then I went to Amplitude, he went to Full Story, and we called each other up and we were like, why is this still so hard, you know, the second time around? And so like, tell me about your experience building a partner program from scratch at Dashlane.
Honestly, at Dashlane, it was fascinating because the Dashlane was known at the time as a password manager, and a really good one. It's a really strong app. It makes so much sense. And it's one of those things where Dashlane's biggest blocker to adoption was people writing down passwords on pieces of paper. Always said, like, it wasn't that we were competing against LastPass or 1Password or any of the other password managers. We were competing against inertia and what people had done for years and years and years. So, what was more interesting to me in coming from Amex, I had spent 5 years thinking about, how do we make Amex top of wallet? And that was the goal for everything we had. So when Dashlane first reached out, they were like, "Yeah, and there's this like digital wallet component of the app. It's like relatively small." And I was like, "What do you mean there's a digital wallet component?" And what they had sort of unintentionally cracked is the ability to save payments credentials within a browser extension. And because the tech was so smart, it could, you know, read the page and essentially autofill credit card information on any site with zero merchant integration.
Hmm.
And this was in the era of, the popular merchant buttons and currency and the networks that try to build their own. And I was like, you guys don't know what you have. Like, you have cracked what every FI has been trying to do forever, which is you can put your credentials in your Dashlane extension. If you get people to download the extension, you can suddenly control the top of wallet of what card becomes default for every site on the planet without engaging merchants. Like, yes, the password manager is great, but you guys don't even realize what you have here. It's going to be massively valuable. So I had joined as partnerships hire number two, and my boss, the head of partnerships, had come from Visa. So both of us were thinking the exact same
Yeah.
thing. And we knew Dashlane didn't necessarily have much of a brand. I think there was a few million users at the time. So for us, it was, how do you create this partnerships pitch that is actually anchored to the wallet as
Mm.
this Trojan horse of, hey, Visa France was one of our first customers. And we said, hey, how about we make, Dashlane Premium, which has all of our services, a benefit for your card. And by the way, we'll create this really easy flow for you guys to make it easy to have the Visa card from your issuers be top of wallet within Dashlane. So for us, there was a massive win-win because we wanted the trust and the validation and the backing of a trusted brand like Visa. It allowed us to use our connections within payments to at least get something started. But it was also massively valuable for us as an acquisition and a trust channel. And for them, we became just one of the many bets that they were making to try to figure out how to become top of wallet. So
Mm.
from there, it kind of built on itself where, once you have the one big logo, then a lot of times the rest of the issuers follow. And, from there, we identified a number of different tech partnerships using APIs and OEMs, and we built everything else that was more traditional tech. But that was like the first big insight for us was, oh my God, we have a unique value that no one is even realizing. And we know a very specific problem that these really big brands have that we are uniquely positioned to solve. So it was a really cool experience to figure that out.
That's awesome. Yeah, and I think the thing that's particularly cool about that, outside of, hey, like going and landing a partnership with Visa when you're such a small team, is kind of mind blowing, right? But outside of that, I think the thing that's really cool is that you and your head of partnerships basically had an insight from being out in the world that the company didn't have, right?
Yeah.
And I think 99% of partnerships people feel the same way, where it's like, hey, we're working with all of these consultancies and agencies and complementary tech providers and the whole thing, and it's like you just gain a level of knowledge that other people in the company just can't have, and I think it's really cool that people listen to you, and we're like, okay, like this sounds like a real thing, we're going to let you work on it. That's like kind of mind-blowing to hear, given that it was like in a different direction to the basically the mission and focus of the product. Like how that must have been a conversation to navigate, I imagine. Like, how did that go?
And it was one of those things where for us, we spent a lot of time, and I learned a lot from our head of partnerships there in this role. We spent a lot of time kind of mapping out the go to market. And we were like, this is something that uniquely solves the partner's pain points, but it also solves a pain point for us around trust and brand validation and all of those things. So we actually spent a little bit of time. And fortunately, we were able to beg the help of one of our founders, who is also our lead engineer, to build a flow that very naturally fit into the rest of Dashlane. We didn't want an experience where, someone would just add their wallet or add their card to the wallet and that was it. And that they wouldn't do any of their passwords or all the other things that we knew made it sticky. So we were able to use, some very light APIs that would create kind of a unique experience that felt very natural to Visa acquired users or Citi acquired users or whoever it was going to be. So I think that definitely helped, balance any hesitation. Like, are you guys turning us into a digital wallet company? No, it's just a way that you think about, where does it most naturally come? It didn't make a ton of sense for Visa to be talking to its customers about passwords. It made a lot of sense for them to be talking about this kind of one-click, simple checkout experience, and also, their personal security.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And like, I mean, for everyone that's trying to go and land a partnership with a company like Visa, it sounds like there was some existing relationship there, but I don't know, tell me a little bit about how a deal like that gets done.
Yeah. Honestly, we were very fortunate where, I think I've learned now later in my career that so much of a partnerships person, their value as an individual contributor is that network that they build over time. I always think of it as, yes, like now I'm working at C2FO, which I love and it's great and the team is super talented, but sometimes you have to keep the perspective that it's almost like you're renting out your network to the role that you're in at that time. Where, I think my boss Chuck had some previous experience at Visa. He'd worked there for a long time to surface concept. I took the same concept to Amex in the same way that we were asking for feedback. And it kind of helped us define that pitch a little bit. But we also just had some trust from those existing relationships. Once we got the first couple down, that's when we could go after these kind of new partnerships where neither of us really had a relationship there. But I remember being quite surprised where I thought it was going to be a lot harder to kind of bang those doors down. And that was the first time I also had the support and help of our CEO helping us make
Mhm.
connections, our investors helping us make connections, our board, for example, and starting to really pull those in when maybe you don't necessarily have as much of a personal or partner brand became really important. So that was also kind of an eye-opening experience as well.
Yeah, that's awesome. And you mentioned that like there was a kind of a clear-ish value prop for Visa, but
Yeah.
you started with Visa France. Like,
Yeah.
was that like a value prop that resonated across Visa as you kind of grew that relationship and partnership, or did you have to kind of revisit that as because the relationship can only take you so far, right?
It's super true. And honestly, we learned a lot and that I've even used like to date in working with issuers and networks at that point where the biggest thing of the biggest challenge of being like a small partner and working with a large FI is that everyone is competing over those same marketing slots. Their product team is working, their marketing team, the partner's marketing team, everyone wants to be in that one email that they send once per quarter, right?
Hmm.
And every time you get in the first one, you have to be able to show that you deserve that slot and then one to go out the next time. So for us, it was really beneficial that we had some relationships as a company that was headquartered in France. So there was a nice thing for us to talk about there. So it was kind of a test case for us to build out from there. What we also learned is that even with that, even as we expanded, it became more advantageous for us to, use the Visa relationship for that kind of constant promotion and those things, but you're still only going to get, one slot per quarter if you're lucky.
Hmm.
So for us, it was the big swing, the big validation, and helped us build our other partnership programs on top of that that were maybe a little bit smaller and candidly a little bit quicker. But
Hmm.
it's really hard to replace like, hey, Visa has validated that we're, a good partner.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. The halo effect that that provides is amazing.
Exactly,
The
exactly.
I at Deal recently, I've been on a few calls with some like really strategic partners that we're working on, and like we're a 3-ish-year-old startup, but one of the fastest growing startups on the planet, and like really doing some amazing stuff. But you're talking to like a publicly traded, like big, like recognizable brand, and
Yeah,
and they're like, okay, so who else are you partnering with? And when we can say, hey, well, also we're working with X, Y, and Z, and then they're like, okay, let's continue the conversation. Whereas if it was like, well, you'd be our biggest partner, then it starts to become a little bit more tricky because they're taking a leap of faith on you.
it's huge. I cannot stress enough what that first big name will do for your life going forward. They all build on each other.
Yeah. Yeah, that's amazing. And so, like, then after a stint back at Amex, you went into working at C2FO, and
Yeah,
you've now been like on the partnerships team, kind of being building the partner program for the first time, and now you're kind of going out on your own and building the partner business for yourself. Like,
yeah.
tell me a little bit about what it was like the second time around. Like, what are some of the learnings that you took from that first run at Dashlane? Like, things did you carry with you and do the same? What are some of the things that you did differently? Would love to hear about that.
Honestly, it's been an absolute adventure and super fun. So when I joined C2FO, partnerships hire number one. They had done a couple type of referral partnerships coming out of our sales team historically, but there wasn't a big focus on it ever. So for me, I took the first 90 days and I just exclusively went and talked to every single person in the company who would talk to me. And it was much more a focus on Tell me what's going well. Tell me what's not going so well. Tell me what your individual challenges are. Because for me, it was starting at absolute square one to understand, like, hey, what were the KPIs? What are we uniquely positioned to achieve in partnerships? What are the roadblocks? What are the things that we, are working that we should be scaling? And it became very clear after many conversations with our client facing employees. So those that are managing our big enterprise buyer clients, but also the small businesses that use us for working capital. There were a number of really clear challenges that I felt like could be uniquely solved by partnerships. The first one was no one knew who we were. That's a pretty clear one. And the way that C2FO operates today, we have about 300 employees who we call supplier relationship managers. And they will call a small business in our supplier network and say, hey, this is Allison calling on behalf of Walmart from C2FO. We can help accelerate your invoices and help you get paid tomorrow instead of 60 days from now, for a low rate. That sounds like a scam. We get the too good to be true thing all the time. And that was one where they were like, again, okay, but like, who do you work with? Who's backing you? Who are you? There was a lot of those types of questions. So that was number one. And the other thing that we learned through lots of interviews with both users and with employees was that C2FO didn't necessarily like play nice with all of the tools where our users were making their working capital decisions. So if you are a small business who is in QuickBooks today, running and making a decision on your capital and watching your cash flow, you would have to jump into the C2FO ecosystem. You would have to do something completely different. The apps weren't syncing. There was no nice plays altogether. So for us, it was how do we lock in on kind of those unique challenges? And then how do we think about unique partner value props? So the Visa example always came back to me because I was looking at the ecosystem and I was like, okay, where can we add some unique value to partnerships? And I was looking for everyone that had anything adjacent to working capital. So ERP systems, AP automation systems, AR automation systems, procurement platforms, like where would it make sense for us to play? And ultimately, we identified that there was this really clear trend toward these platforms attempting to become less of a platform and more of a hub. So what I mean by that is most of them did one thing like super, super well. But for the purposes of, responding to RFPs, they would have like some mediocre features and other things just so they could like check a box, right? And now that you were starting to see expectations change in B2B software. So you were getting people who are more traditionally used to things being as easy as like their iPhone and their app stores. So the platforms that were starting to win were those that did one thing super, super well and that had really seamless APIs into other services that also did their thing well. So our strategy became how do we look for those that working capital is a adjacent product offering and how do we make it super super simple that we become all things for like working capital architecture, and by doing so we get the trust brand to say, hey, yeah, we work with this partner, you use them already, we're in there, but more importantly, like we're in their workflows and making
Mm-hmm.
decisions. So today we're integrated into large procure to pay platforms. We're working with treasury management systems, cash flow forecasting, and we're simply integrating in there. We're making it very easy for users to accelerate capital. So that's really what's kind of driven the strategy. It's how do we solve that unique partner pain point, but also how do we just make it super easy for the user to play nice with us?
That's awesome. And my last job at Amex before I left was actually on one of the sales teams selling Amex's corporate working capital product.
Then you know my space super well.
Yeah, so I spent a little bit of time on it. So yeah, I know it a little bit, and I know that conversation as well. I mean, like ultimately, you're calling small business owners who probably do get scam calls, already, and you're offering them something that could be an absolute game changer for their business, but sounds too good to be true.
Yeah.
And like in the case of, I mean, we don't have to use a real world example, but you mentioned Walmart. Like, I guess like Walmart is like somewhat a partner, a somewhat, are they also like a customer, or like how does that like kind of relationship operate?
Yeah, we have a really unique structure as C2FO, which has been very fundamental to how we think about partnerships. So, Walmart today is a client of C2FO. We
Hmm.
think of them that way. So,
Yeah.
we have about 250 large enterprises who are clients of C2FO and are classified as what we call buyers on the
Hmm.
platform. Now, when Walmart comes on, they'll bring all of their suppliers onto the platform. And I like to think of it as dynamic discounting with some secret sauce. Because what C2FO has done differently is we've built this platform that really focuses more on the supplier. And Walmart would be totally cool with me saying that because what's important about it is that in traditional supply chain finance, you get maybe like the top 10 suppliers, that's what banks are focused on. For C2FO, we want every supplier to be engaged in these programs for working capital, but we make it a lot easier for them for two reasons. If you're a supplier in retail, for example, and you jump onto the C2FO platform, if you sell to Walmart, they're going to be there. But also, if you sell to about 70% of US retail, will be on the platform already for you there. But the other thing is that we have a patent on the ability for a supplier to do what we call name your own rate. So my dad's machine shop in Buffalo, let's say he's selling to GM, let's say they were a client. If my dad traditionally was dealing with them, he'd probably be on some static terms or he'd be, you know, voluntold to accept a certain discount. In C2FO, he has the ability to log in and make an offer that makes sense for him. And the magic in that is my dad can offer a little bit more if he needs to meet payroll tomorrow. But if he's just trying to buy a new machine in 2 months, maybe he wants to offer a little bit less and play the market. And it's this matching of these algorithms and everything that we're doing on the back end of this network effect that really creates this magic where our buyers, so a Walmart, will get the return that they're looking for on the capital they use to fund the early payments. Our suppliers are getting paid early off this 46 trillion that is just sitting there trapped in invoices today. So they're no longer having to pull down from their line of credit or, factoring and paying lots of fees. So it's a much better alternative for them. And we're super proud of the fact that our APR cost, if you put it equivalent to a loan last year, was about 5.2%.
Hmm.
So it's objectively, in most cases, a much better option for suppliers. They just don't know about it. So
Yeah.
it's how do we get it to the top of their mind when if I'm a small business owner, I have 97 things to think about that day that are not C2FO. And same thing when you go up to the enterprise and you're talking to treasurers or procurement leaders or whoever it's going to be.
Yeah, that's awesome. What a cool product. This is amazing. Yeah, it's like very complementary to both sides, of the marketplace that you're working on. It's so, so cool. And so tell me, last one. Uh, like you started working at C2FO in a remote environment. What's it been like, as an exec, joining and working in a remote environment, like with a new vision and strategy and the whole thing? Like, how did you approach that?
Honestly, I thought it was going to be a pretty significant challenge. Most of the rest of the exec team, most of them have been working together for years. And so I'm coming in, sitting thousands of miles away, saying, "Hey, let's think about this differently," without having, candidly, a ton of experience in the working capital space. So if I'm them, I'm probably like, "Okay, who's this new person? Like, chill for a second." But honestly, for me, the first few months where I was just asking a ton of questions brought me back to the Amex days where it was just like, tell me what I don't know. Like, please help me understand. Like, teach me as much as possible. Be super honest with me. And when I'm tossing out ideas, feel free to shred them apart. That is exactly what I'm here to do, to learn. And it required a lot of trust building and asking questions and bringing people along, whether it was in finance or product or engineering or marketing, because I also knew that to do these tech partnerships in the right way, we were going to have a dedicated team. So ultimately, over the course of the past year, because of that buy in that I have and the trust and the great relationships with the other exec, we actually have what I think is relatively unique for partnerships, a cross functional crew between BD, channel sales, products, engineering, and design that is all 100% on partnerships and dedicated
Mm.
to it. So we've been able to move very quickly through a number of these deals, but it all comes back to the trust and working super closely with these execs. It's also been a massive opportunity for us because the 12 people we have across that cross functional team, four of them are in our headquarters city and it really allowed us to expand everywhere. I think we're even going international at this point. So for us, it's been like a pretty massive opportunity to be able to work that way, but it's also very fun to get everybody in person a few times a year.
Yeah, yeah, I bet. You can't beat it. I work remotely now as well, and I love it. Get to hang out with my family more, and
Yeah.
like the quality of life definitely improves. But it is great to get people together once in a while and meet people in person and do all of that good stuff. Well,
Yeah.
amazing to hear. I could spend, I think, a whole hour just on this last bit about how you kind of navigated those exec conversations, but maybe we'll save that for another day. Um, you know. Way that we love to end this conversation is asking, like, what was something recently that you learned that you would like to share with the listeners today?
It's a really good question. And this is going to be like such a cheesy answer that like links to partnership leaders. But I've also found that in my couple times, like building out partnerships from scratch, it can often feel like super isolating. And like my situation is so unique. And I'm just going to have to figure this out, like brunt force. And I'm going to whiteboard everything all over the world. And I feel like what I learned relatively recently is as much as C2FO feels unique, particularly in the fact that we're in a complicated working capital space, we have this network approach, there's buyers and suppliers, and there's a lot of complicating factors. So much of what we're actually doing, so many others have actually gone through before. And it'd be very easy to just say, like, heads down, okay, this is going to be the way that we're doing it. But I think we've saved months off sales cycles and identified some really other stronger partners, but also like probably figured out some roadblocks just by finding peers who can like serve as mentors, particularly when going into these spaces. So there's a really significant value in community as you navigate these things. For example, like my background is much more in API tech partnerships. This was actually my first role in working with system integrators. And I was nervous that I was going to make a fool of myself going down some of these chains and realizing that, people are there, people are willing to share their experiences in a number of different groups has been like massively eye-opening to me. I think I always had the assumption that, oh, like I don't want to share too much or like appear vulnerable or don't like, know what I'm doing in this particular space. And I think what I've learned is like everyone is pretty self-aware in these groups to say, I have these couple things that I know really well, but here's the things that I don't know as well. And people are willing to jump in and help. And that's been very eye-opening to me because as much as it feels like we're a small partnerships team, there's groups that you can go to figure out who's done it before without having to pay like a massive amount for some consulting arrangement. So anyway, that sounds like such a plug. I swear it's not, but that has been like
Thank
very
you.
top of mind for the last few weeks for my team.
Yeah, and I think the thing that we've run into at Partnership Leaders and really tried to uh, cater to and like kind of coach people out of is that exact situation. Less so, I feel like I know so much, but I don't know much about this thing. More so, a lot of people are like, oh, I feel like I don't know anything, so I don't have anything to contribute. And like everyone knows so much, and everyone has the potential to be able to contribute and teach and share with each other. And so like often, often someone will come and ask me a question and they'll say, hey, like what are your thoughts on this? And I'm like, I don't know, but like ask it in the community, and see what people say. And then you get like 5, 10, 20 amazing responses. But you have to kind of like eke it out of people because everyone feels like they're learning and everyone feels like they're inexperienced and that they're doing it for the first time when like actually so many people have this vast wealth of knowledge, even if it is just in a little part of what we do. It's like so valuable to have like 1,000 people all sharing those little snippets of interesting stuff.
It's so true. And honestly, like none of us learned this in school, right? Like as far as I know, there isn't like a major in tech partnerships, so there should
Yeah,
be.
not yet. Yeah, maybe it'll happen one day.
Yeah. So anyway, it sounds like a plug. I swear it's not, but I think just having that self awareness and being really comfortable with being uncomfortable in that has been super valuable for my team and me personally going through this.
Love it. Awesome. Well, Allison, thank you so much for the time. Thank you so much for
Thanks,
sharing your story. Super interesting stuff. I think people are going to take a lot away from this. So, really appreciate it. And we'll speak again soon, I'm sure.
awesome. Thanks so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.